2 weapons, 1 dark room. One of those weapons sold at auction in August 2021 for $6.0 million, the highest price ever paid for a firearm at public auction. Pat Garrett's gun, a Colt single-action Army revolver, .44-40 caliber, 7.5-inch barrel, serial number 55093. Garrett took it off an outlaw named Billy Wilson when he captured Wilson's gang at Stinking Springs on December 23, 1880. He carried it through the winter and the spring through 3 months of hunting Billy the Kid across eastern New Mexico. He was sitting on it, it was still holstered under him, when Billy the Kid walked through Pete Maxwell's door just after midnight on July 14, 1881. Billy's gun, a Colt Model 1877 Thunderer, double action, .41 caliber, compact, fast, designed to be drawn and fired quickly without cocking. Garrett examined it off the floor after the shooting. He described it in his 1882 book, a self-cocker, caliber .41. It had 5 cartridges and 1 shell in the chambers, the hammer resting on the shell. The shell looked old, Garrett wrote. He didn't think much of it. Think about what that room held. Garrett's Colt, 7.5 inches of barrel, a single-action gun you had to cock manually before each shot, designed for deliberate aimed fire at distance. Billy's Thunderer, a shorter, faster double action that fired the instant you pulled the trigger. In pitch darkness at arm's length, Garrett had to draw the bigger gun from beneath his own body and fire before Billy could bring the Thunderer to bear. Garrett fired twice. He wrote it himself in 1882. Quickly as possible, I drew my revolver and fired, threw my body aside and fired again. Read that again. He fired. Then he threw his body aside. Then he fired again. He was moving between shots, not seated calmly on the bed. Moving. And the second shot, the one that came after he threw his body aside, missed Billy. It passed through a piece of furniture standing in the room, a washstand lodged in the wall. Nobody noticed. Not Garrett, not his 2 deputies standing outside, not Pete Maxwell. 4 men in and around that room, and not one of them registered the bullet hole in that washstand that night. It sat there, unexamined, for over 100 years. And when a forensic radiologist finally mapped the angle of that bullet through the wood, the trajectory didn't match where Pat Garrett said he was. This is what I want to walk you through. Pete Maxwell's bedroom was in the old officers' quarters at Fort Sumner, a large adobe room, high ceilings, thick walls. The building is gone now. The Pecos River changed course. The Maxwell house was washed away. The site is marked with a stone, but there's no room left to examine. No wall, no bed, no floor. The only physical object from that room that still exists anywhere is the washstand. On the night of the shooting, Garrett wrote that he was sitting at the head of Maxwell's bed, near the pillow. Maxwell was beside him in the dark. And here's the detail that matters for what comes next. Garrett's Colt was in its holster beneath him. He was literally sitting on his own gun when Billy walked in. Billy entered, raised the Thunderer within a foot of Garrett's chest, back toward the door, and called out, "Quinez? Quinez? Who's that? Who's that?" And then Garrett drew his revolver and fired, threw his body aside, fired again. That word, threw, not shifted, not leaned, threw. Now let me give you the 3 accounts of what happened in that room, because they cannot all be true, and the washstand is the only piece of evidence that doesn't get to pick a side. Account 1 is Garrett's. He writes he recognized Billy's voice, fired while Billy was retreating toward the door, then got up and walked outside to meet his deputies. Calm, controlled, the sequence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Account 2 is from John Poe, Garrett's deputy, who was standing just outside the door. Poe wrote his version in 1919, and it was published in 1933, 10 years after his death. Poe's account mostly backs Garrett's version of the positions, but Garrett's own book records that when he stepped outside afterward, both Poe and McKinney immediately told him he'd shot the wrong man. Neither deputy knew Billy. They'd seen a barefoot, hatless man in his shirt sleeves carrying a butcher knife, and assumed he was one of Pete's Mexican ranch hands. So the only positive identification at the moment of shooting came entirely from Garrett himself. Account 3 is the one almost nobody talks about. Thomas Kip McKinney was Garrett's second deputy that night. He never gave a public interview, never wrote a book, never spoke about that night publicly, as far as any researcher has found. But he did confide in a mining partner named Frederick William Gray. In 1912, Gray published a book called Seeking a Fortune in America. In it, Gray described what McKinney had told him privately. McKinney's version: Garrett wasn't sitting on the bed at all. He had learned Billy would come to see Paulita Maxwell, Pete's sister. The lawmen arrived before Billy. They tied and gagged Paulita. Garrett hid behind the sofa. When Billy appeared clearly in the doorway, Garrett shot him. I have to be honest about this source. True West magazine, which has dug into this story deeper than almost any other publication, notes that while Gray did know McKinney personally, Gray also had what they call some other whoppers about the kid that were pure nonsense. And Texas Ranger James Gillett says McKinney told him a version much closer to Garrett's account. So the Gray story is contested, not confirmed. What it gives us is a third possible position for Garrett in that room, behind the sofa, not on the bed. The reason it matters is what Steve Sederwall found when he ran a laser through the washstand. The washstand stayed in the Maxwell family for decades. Around 1940, it was displayed by Stella Abreu Miller, who had Maxwell family connections at her Billy the Kid Museum in Santa Rosa, New Mexico. Nobody noticed the bullet holes. The washstand passed through private hands and eventually reached the collection of William Worcester's Koch, the same billionaire who paid $2.3 million for the authenticated Billy the Kid tintype in 2011. Koch arranged a forensic examination. Dr. Brandon Nichols, a forensic radiologist, conducted a radiographic analysis of the bullet holes, mapping the entrance and exit points precisely. The findings were published in the Wild West History Association Journal, Volume 16, Number 9. One bullet had entered one side panel and exited the opposite panel, passing completely through. The bullet itself was gone, buried in a wall that no longer exists. What remained was the angle the bullet was traveling when it hit the wood. And the angle is where the story turns. The Las Vegas Daily Gazette published a diagram of Pete Maxwell's bedroom on July 19, 1881, 5 days after the shooting. That diagram shows the washstand on the north wall. Sederwall, a retired law enforcement investigator who spent years on the Billy the Kid cold case, ran a laser through the bullet hole alignment and traced it back across the room. His finding, published in True West magazine, said the laser only lines up correctly from a low position, not from an upright seated position on the bed, but from the floor or near it. Sederwall's reconstruction: Garrett fires his first shot while seated. The muzzle blast of a .44-40 Colt at arm's length in total darkness flash blinds him. He throws his body aside, his own words, makes for the door, hits the wall to the left of the doorway, and goes down. From his knees, his left hand on the floor, blind from the muzzle flash, he fires the second shot, the one that misses Billy, the one that travels along the wall, punches through the washstand, and buries itself in the adobe. Dr. Henry Lee, who worked the O.J. Simpson case, the John Benet Ramsey case, and the Scott Peterson case, also examined the washstand trajectory. Medical investigator Calvin Ostler worked alongside him. In September 2004, Ostler told the Scotsman newspaper their findings suggested Garrett might have been fleeing when he shot the outlaw, but that the sheriff had omitted that detail in his telling of the story. Fleeing, not seated on the bed. Here's what I need to be straight about. The Wild West History Association Journal ran 2 separate room diagrams, north wall and south wall placements for the washstand, precisely because the exact furniture position that night is unconfirmed. If the washstand was against the south wall instead of the north, the trajectory reconstruction changes. Furniture gets moved. Memory is imprecise. The newspaper diagram appeared 5 days after the shooting. This is not a verdict. It is a piece of wood with a bullet hole in it, and the question of where that bullet came from. But here's what doesn't move regardless of the washstand's position. Garrett's own words in his 1882 book say he fired, then threw his body aside, then fired again. The phrase is there. It has always been there. And throwing your body aside is not consistent with sitting calmly on a bed and firing twice in a controlled sequence. It is what someone does when they are moving fast, moving blind, and getting out of the way. The alcalde, the local justice of the peace, Alejandro Segura, held the inquest the morning of July 15. Not a trained coroner, an alcalde. 6 local jurors, all Fort Sumner residents who had known Pete Maxwell and many who had known Billy. They heard from Garrett. They heard from Maxwell. They returned a verdict of justifiable homicide. Nobody asked Garrett about the second shot. Nobody asked him where his body was when he fired it. They didn't know about the bullet in the washstand. Nobody did. That was the official inquiry. Start to finish. Garrett wrote the story in his book. The book sold almost nothing during his lifetime. 8 other books about Billy the Kid beat it to press. But that story became the record, and the record became the legend. 3 accounts of where Garrett was standing. A bullet traveling in a direction more consistent with a man moving fast and low than a man seated upright on a bed. Garrett's own phrase, "threw my body aside," sitting in the primary source for 144 years, unexamined against the physical evidence. The only surviving object from that room. And an alcalde's inquest that lasted 1 morning and never once asked the hard question. Pat Garrett died on February 29, 1908, the leap year date itself a kind of footnote, shot in the back of the head during a roadside dispute over grazing rights. His killer was acquitted on self-defense. Footprints at the scene suggested more than one person present. The man who wrote the only detailed first-person account of Billy the Kid's death was himself killed under disputed circumstances by an official process that left documented questions unanswered. Some things stay consistent. The washstand sits in the Koch collection in Colorado. The entrance hole is in one side panel. The exit hole is in the other. The bullet passed straight through and kept going into a wall that the Pecos River swallowed 100 years ago. That straight line through 144-year-old wood has been pointing at the same question ever since. Pat Garrett wrote the story. The bullet drew its own.